The question landed like a slap across the cabin of Flight 447, sharp enough to cut through the hum of jet engines and the murmur of privileged conversation. Isaiah Okafor, 9 years old and 4 feet tall, looked up from his book on ancient Egypt and met the flight attendant's eyes with a directness that made several nearby passengers shift uncomfortably in their leather seats. "Did you just call us monkeys?" The woman standing over him, nameplate reading Deirdre Castellano, didn't flinch. Her lips curved into something that might have passed for a smile in darker light, and she leaned down just enough that her voice wouldn't carry past the first 3 rows of first class. The words came out slow, deliberate, each syllable a small act of violence. "That's what you are." 5 seconds of silence followed. Not the comfortable quiet of a smooth Tuesday morning flight, but the suffocating kind that happens when a dozen adults realize they're witnessing something unforgivable and every single one of them chooses to look away. Preston Whitmore III, seated in 1A with his Wall Street Journal and his Patek Philippe watch, found sudden fascination in an article about bond yields he'd already read twice. The elderly couple in row 3 who'd been cooing over wedding photos on an iPad went absolutely still. Dr. Vivian Park, a cardiologist heading home from a conference, pressed her lips together and stared at the seat back in front of her with the intensity of someone trying to memorize the safety card. Isaiah's twin brother Elijah sat frozen in 2C, his college-level mathematics textbook forgotten in his lap. Tears welled in his eyes but didn't fall. At 9 years old, he'd already learned that crying in public meant giving people exactly what they expected from boys who looked like him. The morning had started normally enough. Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport at 6:45 a.m., the sky still purple-gray through the terminal windows, the air conditioning fighting a losing battle against Georgia humidity that seeped through every door. Dr. Amara Okafor had moved through the pre-dawn crowds with the practiced grace of someone who'd learned to navigate a hearing world without sound. Her hands signing instructions to her sons as they rolled their carry-ons past the Starbucks kiosks and the Hudson newsstands stuffed with magazines nobody read anymore. She wore a Loro Piana cashmere hoodie the color of charcoal, paired with dark jeans and white sneakers that had cost more than most people's monthly car payments. The outfit looked unremarkable, the kind of thing you'd see on any parent shepherding kids through an airport. That was the point. $2,000 of Italian craftsmanship designed to whisper rather than shout, to pass through the world without drawing the wrong kind of attention. Isaiah had inherited his mother's preference for understated quality. His own hoodie was Brunello Cucinelli, soft as a prayer, paired with joggers and sneakers that wouldn't have looked out of place on a playground. Elijah dressed identically, their mother's insistence on matching outfits one of the few childhood indignities they still tolerated at 9 years old. The gate agent had been the first test of the morning, a white woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She'd scanned their boarding passes and paused. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She looked at the passes again, then at Amara, then back at the screen. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I need to verify these tickets." Amara's voice carried the slight accent that sometimes marked those who'd been deaf since birth, each word carefully shaped. "These are our seats. We booked them 3 weeks ago." The agent's smile tightened. "It's just that first-class tickets sometimes have system errors, and I want to make sure there hasn't been a mistake." 3 other passengers had passed through in the time this conversation took. All white. All waved through without a second glance. Isaiah had watched his mother's jaw set in that particular way that meant she was choosing her battles. Amara pulled up the confirmation email on her phone, then the credit card statement showing the charge. The agent studied both with the thoroughness of a jeweler examining a suspicious diamond. 10 minutes later, they'd been cleared to board, No apology, no acknowledgement of the delay, just a tight-lipped nod and a gesture toward the jetway. The TSA checkpoint had been worse. Isaiah had learned to expect the extra attention by now. The way security guards' eyes tracked him and his brother through airports and department stores and museum lobbies. But understanding didn't make it easier when the officer pulled their mother aside and demanded to search her carry-on, despite the bag having already passed through the scanner without incident. "Ma'am, this is random additional screening." Amara had complied silently, her hands moving through sign language that Isaiah understood without looking. "Let them. It's faster than arguing." The officer had pulled out each item with exaggerated care. Laptop, iPad, chargers, the small leather case containing her heart medication prescription label clearly visible, a hardcover book on venture capital strategies. The officer held up the medication bottle, squinting at the label. "What's this for?" "My heart. The prescription is on the label." The officer had eventually waved them through, but not before a younger colleague muttered something that might have been an apology or might have been annoyance at the backup forming behind them. Isaiah had caught the words procedure, and everyone but suspected they both knew that wasn't quite true. Now, settled into seats 2A, 2B, and 2C, Isaiah had allowed himself to believe the worst was over. First class on a major airline meant a certain level of service, a buffer of courtesy purchased along with the extra legroom and the warm nuts and the flight attendants who smiled with their whole faces instead of just their mouths. He'd been reading about Pharaoh Hatshepsut when Deirdre Castellano made her first pass through the cabin. She'd been warm with Preston Whitmore, leaning in to murmur something about his usual drink preference. She'd been solicitous with the elderly couple, adjusting their reading lights without being asked. She'd ignored the Okafor family entirely. The second pass came 15 minutes later. The cabin had settled into that pre-takeoff rhythm of last-minute phone calls and laptop arrangements and negotiations over armrest territory. The plane was still on the ground, taxiing slowly along the tarmac in the queue for takeoff clearance. Captain Thornton's voice had crackled through the speakers moments earlier, weathered and authoritative, announcing 15 minutes to wheels up. Deirdre had started drink service despite the tax, moving through first class with a cart that clinked with glass and ice. Orange juice for Preston Whitmore, coffee for the elderly gentleman, sparkling water with lime for Dr. Park, who'd quietly specified still, not sparkling, but received sparkling anyway. When Deirdre reached row 2, she paused. Her eyes moved over Amara, who was absorbed in a magazine, then landed on Isaiah and Elijah. Something shifted in her expression, a tightening around the mouth that preceded her lean-in and her whisper. "Why do they always put a bunch of monkeys in first class?" The words hung there like smoke. Isaiah felt his brother's hand find his under the armrest, small fingers squeezing hard enough to hurt. Elijah's breathing had gone shallow and quick, the way it did before he cried. Preston Whitmore's fingers had frozen over his keyboard. The elderly woman gasped, actually gasped, and her husband's hand shot out to grip her knee. Dr. Park's entire body had gone rigid. Nobody said a word. Isaiah's heart hammered against his ribs. He was 9 years old. He'd been taught to respect adults, to use his manners, to keep his voice down in public spaces, but he'd also been taught that silence in the face of hatred wasn't neutrality. His grandmother had marched in Selma. His mother had built a technology empire while navigating a world that tried to diminish her at every turn. Silence was complicity. "Did you just call us monkeys?" His voice came out steadier than he felt, loud enough that conversations stopped in rows 4 and 5. Loud enough that the businessman across the aisle looked up sharply from his spreadsheet. Deirdre straightened. She didn't look embarrassed or caught off guard. If anything, she looked satisfied, like she'd been waiting for this exact confrontation. Her eyes swept the cabin, taking in the dozen passengers now watching, before returning to Isaiah. "That's what you are." Elijah made a sound somewhere between a whimper and a gasp. His free hand moved in sign language, rapid and angry, telling their mother what had just happened. But Amara was still reading, her back to the aisle, oblivious to the exchange happening behind her. Isaiah reached into his pocket with the hand not gripping his brother's and pulled out his phone. His fingers, shaking slightly, navigated to the camera app. He set it to video and propped it against the book on his tray table, angled to catch the aisle. The record light blinked red. Deirdre's eyes flicked to the phone. Her expression didn't change. She straightened fully, adjusted the cart, and continued her service rounds as if nothing had happened. As if she hadn't just called 2 children monkeys in front of a dozen witnesses who all suddenly needed to check their phones or find something fascinating about the ceiling panels. Isaiah counted to 10, then 20. His hands had stopped shaking, but his chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped rubber bands around his lungs. Elijah's signing had become more frantic. Their mother still hadn't turned around. The plane continued its slow taxi. Outside the windows, the Atlanta morning had brightened to full daylight, the tarmac shimmering with heat already despite the early hour. Other planes queued up behind them, a long line of metal birds waiting their turn to climb into the sky. Preston Whitmore cleared his throat. He opened his mouth like he might say something, then closed it again, returned to his newspaper. The elderly couple whispered urgently to each other, but the whispers stayed whispers. Private communications that absolved them of responsibility. Dr. Park stared at her phone screen, unseeing. Her jaw worked like she was chewing words she couldn't quite spit out. Deirdre returned from the galley carrying a tray of beverages. She moved with deliberate slowness past row 2, close enough that Isaiah could smell her perfume, something floral and cloying. She set down drinks for row 3, then 4, then 5. On her way back, she paused again beside Amara. "Ma'am?" Her voice had shifted to something professionally concerned, the tone of someone performing customer service. "I need to verify your boarding passes one more time." Amara looked up from her magazine, her brow furrowed in confusion. She'd missed the entire interaction, the slur in Isaiah's challenge and the deadly silence that followed, but she could read the tension in the cabin. The way conversations had stopped and every pair of eyes was carefully looking anywhere except at her. "We already showed them at the gate." Her voice carried clearly despite the accent. "These are our assigned seats." Deirdre's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "I understand, but sometimes there are computer errors. First class is usually reserved for our frequent flyers and premium members. I just want to make sure there hasn't been a mistake that put you in seats meant for other passengers." The implication landed like a second slap. Isaiah watched his mother's expression shift from confusion to understanding to something harder and colder than he'd seen before. "Our boarding passes are correct." Amara's voice had dropped to the register she used in business meetings, the one that made venture capitalists twice her age sit up straighter. "We paid full price for these seats. We have every right to be here." Deirdre's smile didn't waver. "Of course, ma'am. I just need to see the passes one more time." "Company policy." Isaiah stood up. At 4 feet tall, he barely came to Deirdre's shoulder. But he positioned himself between the flight attendant and his mother with the precision of someone stepping into a carefully rehearsed role. His voice came out measured, each word clearly enunciated. "Our boarding passes are correct. We paid for these seats. We have every right to be here, and I think you know that." Deirdre's eyes widened slightly. Then she laughed, a sound like glass breaking. She looked at Amara, then back at Isaiah. "Sweetheart, I wasn't talking to you. Adults are having a conversation here." The condescension was almost worse than the slur. Isaiah felt heat rise in his chest, anger mixing with humiliation, mixing with the terrible understanding that he was 9 years old, and black and male, and every adult in this cabin had already decided he was the problem. "Adults don't use racial slurs against children." His voice rose slightly, carrying 3 rows back now. Adults don't try to intimidate families because of their race, and adults certainly don't act like what you're acting like right now. The cabin fell into a different kind of sense. This wasn't the cowardly quiet of witnesses avoiding confrontation. This was the stunned silence of people watching a child speak truth to power with more courage than any of them had shown. Elijah stood up beside his brother. His face was streaked with tears now, but his voice when he spoke was steady. You called us monkeys. You said it loud enough for everyone to hear. And now you're trying to make us prove we belong in seats we paid for because you think we don't look like we belong in first class. Preston Whitmore's laptop clicked shut. The elderly couple had stopped whispering. Even Dr. Park had lowered her phone. Deirdre's face flushed red. She glanced around the cabin, suddenly aware that every passenger was watching this confrontation unfold. The businessman who'd been working on spreadsheets, the young woman in 4B who'd been scrolling Instagram, the family of 3 in row 5, all of them finally paying attention. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Deirdre's voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. I never said anything inappropriate. Isaiah held up his phone. The record light still blinked red. Actually, you did, and I've been recording ever since. The color drained from Deirdre's face. Around the cabin, passengers shifted uncomfortably as they realized they'd been complicit in something that was now being documented. Their silence was on tape. Their cowardice was preserved for posterity. You can't record me without permission. Deirdre reached for the phone. Isaiah stepped back smoothly, keeping the device out of reach. Actually, I can. We're in a public space, and you're a public employee providing a service. But more importantly, I'm documenting discrimination, which is not only legal but necessary. The words came out with a clarity that suggested he'd heard them before, maybe from his mother during one of those conversations about what to do when the world treated you like you didn't belong. Preston Whitmore cleared his throat again. This time he actually spoke. I heard it. His voice was barely above a whisper. I heard her say it. The admission seemed to cost him something. He wouldn't meet Isaiah's eyes, staring instead at his hands folded on the closed laptop. But it was something, a single crack in the wall of sense. Deirdre looked around desperately, as if hoping one of the other passengers would come to her defense, would back up her version of events, would help her out of the hole she'd dug for herself. Nobody moved. Elijah's hands flashed in sign language, telling their mother everything in rapid detail. Amara's expression shifted from confusion to fury to something colder and more calculating. She stood, graceful despite the confined space, and faced Deirdre directly. Where's your supervisor? Her voice was quiet, but it carried. We'd like to speak to whoever's in charge of this flight. Deirdre's eyes darted toward the front of the plane where a male flight attendant was helping passengers in premium economy. She was trapped between her growing panic and her stubborn refusal to admit wrongdoing. Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot. Her voice had taken on a conciliatory tone that fooled exactly nobody. Why don't we just forget this whole thing happened and enjoy the rest of the flight? Isaiah looked at her with the kind of steady gaze that made adults uncomfortable. Forget that you called us monkeys. Forget that you tried to make us prove we belonged in seats we paid for. Forget that you think our dignity is something you can step on without consequences. He shook his head slowly. No, we're not forgetting anything, and neither should you. Elijah had pulled out his own phone and started recording as well. What's your full name? For the record. Deirdre backed away as if the children were somehow dangerous. You don't need my name. Actually, we do. Isaiah's voice was matter-of-fact. When we file our complaint, and we will be filing a complaint, we want to make sure we spell everything correctly. We want to make sure the people who investigate this know exactly who said what and when they said it. The elderly woman in row 3 whispered something to her husband, who shook his head firmly. Whatever she'd suggested, probably that they should intervene, should say something, should do anything to help, he was having none of it. They'd already chosen their side through their silence. The young woman in 4B was recording too, but not to help. She held her phone at an angle that suggested she was capturing this drama for her social media, treating this family's trauma as entertainment, as content to be consumed and commented on and forgotten by tomorrow. Deirdre was beginning to panic. What had started as casual cruelty was spiraling beyond her control, and the children she'd tried to humiliate were taking charge of the situation with a composure that made her own behavior look even more shameful by comparison. I need to continue my service duties. She tried to regain some authority. We'll discuss this later. No. Isaiah's voice was firm. We'll discuss it now. Because later you might conveniently forget what you said. Later you might come up with excuses or explanations that make you sound less terrible than you actually are. But right now, in this moment, we all know exactly what happened. He gestured around the cabin at the other passengers who suddenly found their phones and magazines fascinating again. Everyone here heard you call us monkeys. Everyone here watched you try to make us prove we belonged in our own seats. And everyone here chose to do absolutely nothing about it. The words hit the cabin like a physical blow. Passengers squirmed in their seats, confronted by a truth they'd been trying desperately to avoid. They weren't just witnesses to discrimination. They were enablers of it. Elijah stepped closer to Deirdre, who was now backed against the galley area with nowhere to retreat. You know what the worst part is? His young voice carried a wisdom that shouldn't have been necessary. You didn't just hurt us. You hurt yourself. Because now everyone here knows exactly who you are and what you stand for. And they know who they are too. He looked around the cabin at the silent passengers, his gaze lingering on each face. They know they're the kind of people who watch children get called racial slurs and do nothing. They know they're the kind of people who value their own comfort more than someone else's dignity. They know they're the kind of people who let hate happen right in front of them and pretend they didn't see it. Preston Whitmore was red-faced with shame now. The elderly couple whispered urgently to each other. The young woman had stopped recording and was staring at her hands. But still nobody spoke up. Still nobody said the 3 words that might have made a difference. That's not okay. The plane had reached the front of the takeoff queue. Through the windows, Isaiah could see the runway stretching out ahead, heat waves making the distant buildings shimmer. In a few minutes, they'd be in the air, trapped in this tube of complicity at 30,000 feet. Amara's hand found Isaiah's shoulder, then Elijah's. She signed something quick and private, meant only for them. Both boys nodded. Isaiah looked at his phone. The video was still recording. 43 minutes and counting. Every word, every silence, every shameful glance away, all of it documented. Deirdre seemed to realize she was losing control of the situation. She straightened her uniform, tried to reassemble the professional mask that had slipped so thoroughly. I'll get the senior flight attendant. Her voice was tight. She turned and walked quickly toward the cockpit, her composure cracking with every step. The passengers in first class sat in their expensive seats, breathing their carefully filtered air, and couldn't meet the eyes of 2 9-year-old boys who'd just taught them what courage looked like. Isaiah sat back down. His hands were shaking again, adrenaline catching up with him now that the immediate confrontation had paused. Elijah climbed into the seat beside him, their mother between them, and they waited. The plane's engines changed pitch. They were next in line for takeoff. But something had shifted in the air, a tension that had nothing to do with aerodynamics and everything to do with the terrible reckoning that was coming. Preston Whitmore leaned across the aisle. His voice was low, meant to carry only to row 2. I'm sorry. I should have said something. I heard every word and I said nothing. It was pathetic, a plea for absolution from the very people he'd failed. Isaiah looked at him without speaking for a long moment. When he finally responded, his voice carried the weight of disappointment deeper than any 9-year-old should have to feel. You're sorry that you got caught being a coward. You're sorry that your silence is now on record. You're sorry that the woman whose respect might have benefited your career watched you choose comfort over courage. He paused. You weren't sorry when it was happening. You weren't sorry when we had to stand up for ourselves. You're only sorry now because you realize there might be consequences for your sins. Preston Whitmore closed his mouth. There was nothing he could say to that because every word was true. The cockpit door opened. A man emerged, tall and broad-shouldered with silver hair and the kind of weather-beaten face that spoke of decades in cockpits. His uniform was crisp, his stride confident, his expression already set in that particular combination of authority and annoyance that suggested he'd decided who was at fault before hearing a single word. Captain Brock Thornton had been flying for 32 years. He'd landed planes in thunderstorms and crosswinds that would have terrified younger pilots. He'd handled drunk passengers in medical emergencies, and that one time a snake had somehow gotten loose in the cargo hold and made its way into the cabin. He was not accustomed to being questioned, and he definitely wasn't accustomed to taking orders from children. His eyes swept the first-class cabin, landing on the Okafor family with the kind of assessment that had already reached a verdict. "Is there a problem here?" His voice carried the expected authority, the timbre of someone used to being obeyed without question. Deirdre practically lunged toward him, relief flooding her face. "Captain Thornton, thank God, these children are being disruptive, recording without permission, making false accusations. I need you to handle this." Isaiah looked up at the captain with the same calm directness he'd shown Deirdre. "Sir, your flight attendant called our family monkeys, then tried to make us prove we belonged in seats we paid for. We've been recording the conversation because we want to make sure there's a record of exactly what happened." Thornton's face remained impassive. He'd dealt with complaints before. He'd heard passengers make all kinds of accusations about his crew. In his experience, the truth usually lay somewhere in the middle, and the fastest way to solve any problem was to establish authority immediately and worry about details later. "I'm sure there's been some kind of misunderstanding." The words came out practiced, automatic. "Let's all just calm down and—" "There's no misunderstanding." Elijah's voice cut through. She said, and I quote, "Why do they always put a bunch of monkeys in first class?" When my brother asked if she called us monkeys, she said, "That's what you are." "Would you like to hear the recording?" Thornton's expression flickered just for a moment. Then it hardened into something colder. "On my aircraft, I'm the law." He let the words hang there, heavy with implication. "My crew has informed me that you're being disruptive and refusing reasonable requests. Now, I can handle this the easy way or the hard way, but either way we're going to resolve this situation before we take off." He didn't ask to see the boarding passes, didn't ask Deirdre for her version of events, didn't acknowledge that maybe, possibly, there might be two sides to this story, and one of them involved his employee using a racial slur against children. Amara stood. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made Thornton actually pause. "Your employee used racial slurs against my children. In front of witnesses. When my sons, who are 9 years old, confronted her about it, she doubled down instead of apologizing. We have video evidence. We have witnesses, though apparently not willing ones. And now you're standing here threatening us instead of addressing what actually happened." Thornton's jaw set. "Ma'am, I don't know what you think happened, but I trust my crew. If Deirdre says there's been a misunderstanding, then there's been a misunderstanding. Now I need you and your children to stop recording, stop making accusations, and allow us to complete our service so we can get this flight in the air." Isaiah felt something cold settle in his chest. This man wasn't going to help them. This man had already decided they were the problem. Authority had spoken, and authority was on Deirdre's side. "We're not stopping the recording." Isaiah's voice was steady. and we're not accepting your version of events that conveniently erases what your employee said and did. If you want to get this flight in the air, you can start by addressing the discrimination that happened in your cabin." Thornton's face flushed. He wasn't used to being talked back to, especially not by children. In his 3 decades of flying, passengers had learned quickly that the captain's word was final. Federal regulations gave him absolute authority over his aircraft. What he said went. "Young man, I'm going to give you one chance to change your tone." He leaned down, bringing his face level with Isaiah's. "You're on my aircraft, which means you follow my rules, and my first rule is respect for the crew. Are we clear?" Isaiah didn't blink. "Are we clear that your crew just called us monkeys and you're doing nothing about it?" The standoff lasted 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. Thornton straightened. His expression had gone from annoyed to furious. "Deirdre, call the tower. Tell them we need to return to the gate." He looked back at the Okafor family. "You're being removed from this flight." The cabin erupted in murmurs. Preston Whitmore actually started to stand, then thought better of it and sank back into his seat. The elderly woman grabbed her husband's arm. Dr. Park's hands had formed fists so tight her knuckles had gone white. "On what grounds?" Amara's voice was ice. "Disruption of crew duties. Refusal to comply with crew instructions. Creating a disturbance in the cabin." Thornton rattled off the charges with the ease of someone who'd used them before. "You'll be escorted off, and if you resist, airport security will become involved." The plane began to turn, taxiing back toward the terminal. The captain's voice came over the intercom, professionally apologetic. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're returning to the gate briefly due to a passenger situation. We apologize for the delay and will have you on your way shortly." Isaiah looked at his mother. She signed something quick, a question. He signed back. "Let them. We need witnesses." Because that's what this was really about now. Not whether they'd make their flight, not whether they'd get to Los Angeles in time for the meeting that would determine the future of Okafor Innovation's expansion plans. This was about making sure that when the violence came, and Isaiah was increasingly certain it would come, there would be no question about who was at fault. The plane reached the gate. The engines powered down. Through the windows, Isaiah could see ground crew moving into position, confused by the unexpected return. Thornton pulled out his radio. "Send security to gate A7. We have passengers who need to be removed." The crackling response confirmed what Isaiah had been dreading. 2 officers 5 minutes out. The cabin had gone absolutely silent. Every passenger was watching now, phones either openly recording or held in laps with cameras running. Whatever happened next would be witnessed. Whatever happened next would be documented. And whatever happened next, Isaiah knew with the terrible certainty of someone much older than 9, was going to be worse than anything that had come before. The security officers arrived with the self-assured stride of men who'd done this 100 times before. Officer Tyrell Knox led the way, 42 years old with shoulders that strained against his uniform shirt and a jaw that suggested he'd played football in a previous life. His partner, younger and visibly uncertain, hung back half a step as they entered the jetway. Knox's eyes swept the first-class cabin and locked onto row 2, with the kind of instant assessment that came from years of making snap judgments about who belonged where. The calculation took maybe 3 seconds. Black family, expensive seats, captain standing over them looking frustrated. The math wrote itself. "Ma'am, you and your children need to come with us." Amara remained seated, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "Officer, there's been a misunderstanding. We'd like to speak with a supervisor before we go anywhere." Knox's expression didn't change. "There's no misunderstanding. The captain has requested your removal from the aircraft. You can come voluntarily or we can make this difficult, but either way, you're leaving this plane." Isaiah's phone was still recording, propped against his book where the camera could capture everything. Elijah held his own device at chest level, fingers white-knuckled around the edges. Neither boy moved. "Can you tell us what regulation we've violated?" Amara's voice stayed level, each word precisely enunciated. "We paid for our tickets. We've complied with all safety requirements. We haven't threatened anyone or caused any physical disturbance. The captain says you're being disruptive." Knox took a step closer. "That's all the justification I need." Preston Whitmore shifted in his seat. The movement drew Knox's attention for half a second before the officer dismissed him and refocused on the Okafors. The businessman's mouth opened like he might speak, then closed again. The moment passed. "We have video evidence that a flight attendant used racial slurs against my sons." Amara's hands remained still, but her voice had developed an edge. "We have witnesses who heard it. All we're asking for is proper documentation of the incident before we proceed anywhere." Knox's hand moved to his belt, fingers brushing the handcuffs. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask again. Stand up and come with us peacefully." Elijah's breathing had gone shallow and rapid. Isaiah reached over and squeezed his brother's hand, the same way Elijah had done for him earlier. Their mother's eyes moved between her sons and the officer, calculating odds that all came out badly. "May I gather our belongings?" Her hands moved toward the overhead bin. Knox stepped forward faster than seemed necessary for a man his size. His hand caught Amara's wrist mid-reach. That's when everything accelerated. "Don't touch my mom." Isaiah was on his feet before conscious thought caught up with instinct. His small hand grabbed Knox's forearm, trying to pull the officer away. Knox reacted on muscle memory and training designed for threats that looked nothing like a 9-year-old boy. He shoved Isaiah backward with enough force that the child's legs hit the armrest and he went down hard. The impact drove air from Isaiah's lungs in a sharp gasp. His head caught the edge of the seat on the way down, and suddenly there was red. Blood sheeted down Isaiah's temple, warm and shockingly bright against his dark skin. Elijah screamed, a sound that cut through the cabin like a siren. The elderly woman in row 3 gasped and grabbed her husband's arm hard enough to leave marks. Dr. Park was halfway out of her seat before some paralysis of indecision froze her there, suspended between action and safety. Knox didn't apologize, didn't check to see if the child he'd just injured needed help. Instead, he grabbed Amara's other arm and twisted it behind her back with practiced efficiency. The plastic handcuffs came out, the zip-tie kind that had replaced metal in most airport security arsenals, because they were cheaper and just as effective at controlling people. "You're under arrest for interfering with a flight crew and resisting lawful orders." The cuffs went on too tight. Amara's face showed pain for the first time, a brief flicker before she locked it down. But Isaiah saw it. Elijah saw it. The plastic bit into their mother's wrists, cutting off circulation, the edges designed to hurt just enough to remind you who held power. "She's deaf." Dr. Park's voice finally emerged, thin and desperate. "She can't hear you giving orders. You need to slow down and explain what's happening." Knox ignored her completely. He hauled Amara upright with enough force that she stumbled. His partner finally moved, but only to block the aisle, preventing anyone else from intervening. Isaiah tried to stand. The cabin swam, his vision blurring at the edges where blood was getting in his eye. He wiped at it with his sleeve and left a smear of red across the Brunello Cucinelli cashmere. "Stop! Please stop! You're hurting her!" Knox's response was to pull Amara toward the aisle. She went because fighting would make things worse. Because she had 2 sons watching. Because 38 years of navigating a world that treated her as less than had taught her when resistance became suicide. But Elijah wasn't 38. He launched himself at Knox with all the fury of a child watching his mother being brutalized. His small fists connected with the officer's leg, ineffectual but desperate. Knox's partner grabbed Elijah and hauled him back. The boy fought, all coordination lost to panic and rage. His math textbook fell from his lap and skittered down the aisle. pages bent under someone's shoe. "Don't hurt my brother!" Isaiah lurched forward, still bleeding, and Knox's free hand shot out to grab him too. Fingers dug into Isaiah's shoulder hard enough to bruise through the hoodie. "Both of you settle down right now, or you're going to detention too." The threat landed like ice water. Detention. Two 9-year-old boys facing arrest because they'd tried to protect their mother from violence that every adult in this cabin was watching happen without lifting a finger to stop it. Amara's voice cut through, urgent and fierce despite the pain she had to be feeling. "Isaiah, Elijah, stop fighting. Let them do what they're going to do. Stay calm." Her sons froze. Not because they wanted to, but because their mother had asked. Because some part of them understood that this situation was already spiraling toward disaster and resistance would only accelerate the descent. Knox marched Amara toward the front of the plane. His grip on her arm was visible from 3 rows back, fingers pressing into flesh hard enough to leave marks. She moved with as much dignity as anyone could manage while being frog-marched in handcuffs, her head up, her spine straight. Isaiah and Elijah followed because the alternative was being separated from their mother. Knox's partner shepherded them like stray dogs, one hand hovering near each boy's shoulder without quite touching. They passed Preston Whitmore, who had his phone out now, filming everything with shaking hands. They passed the elderly couple, the woman openly crying while her husband stared at his lap. They passed Dr. Park, who mouthed the word sorry as if that meant anything at all. Deirdre Castellano stood near the galley with her arms crossed and a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She'd won. She'd called black children monkeys, and when they dared to call her on it, the full weight of authority had come down on their side, not hers. The system had worked exactly as designed. The jetway felt longer than it had during boarding. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The carpet was that particular shade of blue that existed nowhere in nature. Isaiah's blood dripped onto it, leaving spots that would need industrial cleaning. At the gate, airport management had materialized. A white man in his 50s wearing a suit that fit poorly and an expression of deep inconvenience introduced himself as Daniel Robbins, station manager. His eyes took in Amara in handcuffs, the blood streaming down Isaiah's face, Elijah's tear-streaked cheeks. What happened here? Knox delivered his report with the clipped efficiency of someone who'd written this script before. Disruptive passengers, refused lawful orders, interfered with crew, became physically aggressive when security arrived. Every word was technically true in the way that mattered to reports and incident forms. Every word was a lie in the way that mattered to actual justice. That child is bleeding. Robbins pointed at Isaiah. He fell during the removal process, became combative. He's 9 years old. He interfered with my partner restraining his mother. The circular logic was airtight. The child had been injured because he'd tried to stop his mother from being hurt, and his mother had been hurt because the child had interfered. Cause and effect tangled into a knot that blamed the victims for their own brutalization. "I need to make a phone call." Amara's voice carried clearly despite everything. "Constitutional right to contact counsel." Knox looked at Robbins. Robbins looked at Knox. Some silent communication passed between them, the kind that happened between men who'd worked in systems long enough to know which rules mattered and which could be bent. "After we get you processed." Knox steered Amara toward a door marked Security Office. Authorized personnel only. The small room beyond smelled like burnt coffee and industrial cleaner. 4 plastic chairs around a metal table. Posters about TSA procedures covering walls the color of old teeth. A camera in one corner. Red light blinking to indicate it was recording everything. Knox removed Amara's handcuffs with the same rough efficiency he'd used to apply them. Red marks ringed both wrists where the plastic had bitten deep. She flexed her fingers, working circulation back into hands that had gone pale and cold. Isaiah slumped into one of the chairs. His head throbbed where it had connected with the armrest. The bleeding had slowed to a trickle, but his face was a mask of drying blood. Elijah sat beside him, still crying silently, his entire body shaking with suppressed sobs. "Someone needs to look at my son." Amara's hands moved through the signs even as she spoke, her body reverting to its primary language under stress. "He's injured and possibly concussed." Robbins had followed them into the room. He pulled out his radio. "Get a paramedic to Security Office B. Head injury minor." Minor. The word hung there like an accusation. Isaiah's blood was all over his expensive hoodie and the station manager called it minor. Now. Amara's voice had shifted registers into something that made even Knox pause. "My phone call. Before anything else happens." Knox looked to Robbins again. The station manager's face suggested he was doing calculations about liability and publicity and how this might play out if it escalated further. He nodded. One call. Amara's phone had been in her pocket through everything. Miraculously unbroken, unlike so many things in the past hour. Her fingers, still shaking slightly from the cuffs, navigated to her contacts. She found the number she needed and pressed dial. The phone rang 3 times. When the voice answered, warm and concerned, Amara's carefully maintained composure cracked just slightly. "This is Dr. Amara Okafor, employee ID Alpha 7749. A pause while the person on the other end processed this. "I need you to ground Flight 447 immediately. Captain Brock Thornton, and I need every flight he's scheduled for this week grounded pending investigation." Silence in the security office. Knox and Robbins exchanged glances that suggested they thought she was delusional, some kind of breakdown happening in real time. The voice on the other end asked a question. Amara's response was measured but absolute. "Do it now, and I need Chairman Castellano on the phone in 5 minutes. Not 10, not when it's convenient. 5 minutes." She ended the call, set the phone on the table, looked at Knox and Robbins with an expression that contained no satisfaction, no triumph, just exhausted certainty about what was about to happen. "Who did you just call?" Robbins tried to keep his voice steady, but something in Amara's demeanor had shifted the power dynamic in the room. Someone who understands the concept of accountability. Knox's radio crackled. His hand moved to it automatically, years of conditioning overriding confusion. "All units, be advised Flight 447 is grounded by executive order. Do not clear for departure. Repeat, do not clear for departure. Captain Thornton is to report to management immediately." The color drained from Robbins's face. Knox's hand stayed frozen on the radio, his expression cycling through disbelief towards something that looked like dawning horror. The paramedics arrived before anyone could process what was happening. 2 young EMTs with the equipment bag in professional concern. They took one look at Isaiah and went to work immediately. Gloves on, gauze out, checking his pupils for signs of concussion. "Can you tell me your name?" The lead paramedic, a woman with kind eyes, knelt to Isaiah's level. "Isaiah Okafor. My head hurts and I feel dizzy, I bet you do." She worked while she talked, cleaning blood away to reveal a gash above his temple that would need attention but wasn't life-threatening. "You took a pretty good knock there. Do you remember what happened?" "An officer pushed me and I hit the armrest." The paramedic's hands paused for just a second. Her eyes flicked to Knox, then back to Isaiah. She continued working without comment, but her expression had shifted into something careful and deliberate. This was evidence now. This injury would need documentation that couldn't be explained away. "We need to get you to the clinic for proper treatment, possible concussion protocol." She looked at Amara. "Are you Mom?" "Yes, you'll need to come with us, and—" She glanced at Elijah, who was still shaking. "This one, too. He's showing signs of shock." Knox stepped forward like he might object. Robbins put a hand on his arm, stopping him. Whatever calculation the station manager was running had reached a conclusion that involved not preventing medical treatment for injured children. The airport medical clinic was 3 terminals over. They made the walk through moving walkways and past food courts where travelers queued for overpriced sandwiches and coffee that tasted like cardboard. People stared at the paramedics, at the blood on Isaiah's face, at Elijah's tears. Nobody asked if they could help. The clinic smelled like antiseptic and anxiety. A nurse took Isaiah's vitals while the paramedic wrote up her report with the kind of detail that suggested she knew this would end up in a legal proceeding. Blood pressure elevated but stable, pupils reactive, laceration to right temple, approximately 2 centimeters requiring closure, multiple contusions consistent with impact trauma. Amara sat in a plastic chair and watched her sons being treated for injuries they'd sustained because a flight attendant had called them monkeys and every system designed to protect them had instead chosen violence. Her wrists still bore red marks from the handcuffs. Her shoulders ached from having her arms wrenched behind her back. But it was the look on Isaiah's face, that terrible adult understanding in 9-year-old eyes, that hurt most of all. Elijah had stopped crying but couldn't seem to stop shaking. The nurse brought him a blanket and hot chocolate from somewhere, small kindnesses that felt obscene in their inadequacy. He wrapped himself in fleece and stared at nothing, processing trauma that would require years of therapy to unpack. Isaiah's wound took 6 butterfly bandages. The nurse who applied them was gentle, her hands steady, her voice soothing. But she couldn't bandage the rest of it, couldn't close the wound of watching his mother dragged away in handcuffs, couldn't treat the injury of adult silence in the face of childhood pain. Amara's phone buzzed. She checked the screen. 5 minutes had passed since her call. The timing was precise to the second. Dr. Okafor. The voice on the other end belonged to Edward Castellano, chairman of the board for the airline that employed his sister Deirdre, though Amara didn't know about that family connection yet. He sounded exactly like what he was, a man in his 60s who'd just been told that his company had catastrophically failed one of its largest shareholders. I've been briefed on the situation. I cannot express how deeply sorry. Your crew called my sons monkeys. Amara cut through the corporate apology with surgical precision. Your flight attendant, Deirdre Castellano, used that exact word. When my children confronted her, she confirmed it on camera. When we requested to speak with the supervisor, your captain had us violently removed. My 9-year-old son is currently being treated for a head injury sustained when your security officer assaulted him. Silence on the other end, the kind that suggested someone frantically signaling assistance to pull up files, to get lawyers on the phone to start the damage control process. I need you to understand something, Mr. Castellano. This isn't about one flight attendant having a bad day. This isn't about a misunderstanding that can be smoothed over with flight vouchers and an apology. This is about systematic failure at every level of your organization. Dr. Okafor, I assure you we take this very seriously. Deirdre Castellano is suspended effective immediately pending investigation. Captain Thornton as well. We'll be conducting a full review. No. The word landed like a gavel. You'll be conducting terminations, plural, because I'm not interested in investigations that conclude with sensitivity training and performance improvement plans. I want everyone who touched this situation fired, and I want their names. There are legal considerations, employee rights. I own 12% of your company. Amara's voice stayed level but gained weight. I have a seat on your board by proxy, and right now I'm sitting in an airport medical clinic watching doctors treat my son for injuries sustained because your employees decided that black children don't deserve basic human dignity, so when I say I want names, you're going to provide them. Are we clear? The silence stretched longer this time. Through the clinic's window, Amara could see planes taking off and landing. the normal rhythm of air travel continuing as if the world hadn't just cracked open. "We're clear." Edward Castellano's voice had changed timbre, moving from corporate smooth to something more raw. "Deirdre Castellano, flight attendant. Brock Thornton, captain. They'll both be terminated within the hour. I'll also need to review the actions of airport security. Officer Terrell Knox. Badge number should be in the incident report, and your station manager Daniel Robbins, who witnessed a bleeding child and called it minor." Edward Castellano was writing all of this down. She could hear the scratch of pen on paper. "There's one more thing." Amara watched Isaiah wince as the nurse applied the last bandage. "I want a list of every discrimination complaint filed against your airline in the past 5 years. Every single one. How many were filed, how many were investigated, how many resulted in disciplinary action. That's confidential employee information." "Not anymore, it isn't. Because I'm going to find out anyway, and the question is whether you provide it willingly or whether my lawyers extract it through discovery. Your choice." The pen stopped scratching. "I'll have it compiled by end of business today." "Good." Amara ended the call without saying goodbye. Isaiah had been listening to his mother's half of the conversation, reading her face and body language the way deaf children's kids learn to do. When she put the phone down, he signed a question. "Did you fire them?" She signed back. "Yes, and there's more coming." The clinic door opened. Robbins entered, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Dr. Okafor, I've just been informed." His eyes darted around the room like he might find an escape route. "I had no idea of your position with the company. If you had known, you would have treated us with basic human dignity." Amara's voice could have frozen nitrogen. "You would have prevented your security from assaulting a child? You would have demanded answers instead of accepting the word of a captain who never even looked at our boarding passes?" She stood, her full height matching Robbins despite his advantage in size. "The problem, Mr. Robbins, is that respect shouldn't be conditional on someone's net worth or corporate position. My sons deserved protection when you thought we were nobody. They deserved it when you thought we were just another black family taking up space in first class. The fact that you only care now that you know who I am tells me everything I need to know about your character." Robbins opened his mouth, closed it. Nothing he could say would make this better, and they both knew it. "You'll be hearing from our attorneys." Amara gathered her sons with a gesture. "Come on, babies, we're done here." The walk back through the terminal felt different. People still stared, but now some of them pointed, phones out, recognition dawning. Someone had posted the video, Isaiah's recording uploaded by someone who'd been on the plane, or maybe Preston Whitmore's footage, or the young woman's Instagram story. However it had started, it was spreading. By the time they reached the main terminal, Isaiah's phone showed 37 notifications. Text messages from friends who'd seen the video. Calls from numbers he didn't recognize. News alerts from outlets that had picked up the story. Flight 447 discrimination. Video goes viral. Airline faces backlash. The views were climbing in real time. 10,000, 50,000, 100,000. The algorithm had found it, decided it was engagement gold, and started pushing it to feeds across the country. "Mom." Elijah's voice was small and uncertain. "People are watching?" "Yes." Amara's hands moved through signs even as she spoke. "They're watching what happened. They're watching what those people did, and they're watching what happens next, what does happen next. Justice." Her voice carried certainty she wasn't sure she felt, or something close to it. They'd reached the main terminal when the news vans appeared. 3 of them, parked in the passenger pickup zone where they absolutely weren't supposed to be. Cameras and microphones and reporters who'd clearly been tipped off that a story was developing. "Dr. Okafor." A blonde woman in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent stepped forward, microphone extended. "Can you comment on the incident aboard Flight 447? We understand you and your sons were removed from—" No comment. Amara moved her sons past the cameras, keeping her body between them and the lenses. "Not right now. Is it true that a flight attendant used racial slurs? That airport security injured your child?" The reporter followed, persistent. "The public deserves to know what happened." Amara stopped, turned, looked directly into the camera with the kind of controlled fury that would play on every news channel by evening. "What happened is that a flight attendant called my 9-year-old sons monkeys. When they asked her to clarify, she confirmed it. When we requested to speak with a supervisor, the captain had us violently removed without reviewing any evidence. Airport security assaulted my child, causing injuries that required medical treatment. And every single adult passenger who witnessed this chose silence over solidarity." She paused, letting that sink in. "The public doesn't deserve to know what happened. The public needs to reckon with why it keeps happening. And they need to understand that this time, there will be consequences." The camera kept rolling. The reporter tried to ask follow-up questions, but Amara was already moving. Her sons tucked close, heading for the exit where their driver waited with the kind of perfect timing that suggested he'd been monitoring the situation. The car was cool and quiet and safe. Isaiah and Elijah climbed into the back seat, exhaustion finally catching up with adrenaline. The driver, Marcus, an older black man who'd worked for Amara for years, met her eyes in the rearview mirror. "Home or office?" "Office." They had a $200 million deal presentation scheduled for 3 p.m. Los Angeles time. She'd missed the flight, but the meeting could still happen virtually. Amara Okafor hadn't built a technology empire by letting obstacles derail her, even obstacles as grotesque as the past 2 hours. The drive through Atlanta traffic gave her time to think. Her phone continued buzzing. Texts from board members, calls from investors, emails from lawyers, the machinery of response spinning up. But underneath all of it, a colder calculation. This couldn't just be about one flight attendant and one captain. The system that had enabled this wasn't Deirdre and Thornton. They were symptoms. The disease ran deeper. Her phone rang again. The chairman calling back. "Dr. Okafor." Edward Castellano sounded like he'd aged a decade in the past hour. "I've completed the preliminary review you requested. The numbers are—" He paused and she could hear paper rustling. "They're not good." "How not good?" 47 complaints in 5 years. Racial discrimination, disability discrimination, religious discrimination. 41 of them were dismissed without disciplinary action. 6 resulted in mandatory training that was never followed up on. And Deirdre Castellano? 12 complaints. Same pattern, same dismissals. She has a brother on our board of directors which may have influenced— She has a what? The connection went quiet. Amara could practically hear Edward realizing he'd just revealed a conflict of interest that made everything infinitely worse. "Her brother is on your board, which oversees the very complaint process that repeatedly cleared her despite a pattern of discrimination spanning years. I wasn't aware of the connection until this morning." Edward's voice had gone hollow. He recused himself from today's termination decisions, but the pattern you're describing— The pattern I'm describing is systematic protection of employees who abuse passengers. Enabled by corporate leadership with personal interests in maintaining the status quo. Amara watched Atlanta slide past the car window. Streets she knew. Buildings where she'd closed deals and launched products and built something from nothing while navigating a world designed to diminish her. "I'm selling my stake. Every share. All 12%. And I'm going public with exactly why. Dr. Okafor, please, the stock will reflect the true value of a company that treats children like mine the way yours did today." She ended the call. opened her brokerage app. Her finger hovered over the sell button for shares worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Isaiah watched from his seat, understanding more than any 9-year-old should have to. Will that hurt them? His voice was quiet. Yes. Good. Amara hit the button. The order processed. 12% of a major airline dumped on the market in a single transaction. By the time the car pulled up to Okafor Innovations headquarters, the stock had dropped 17%. By market close, it would be down 34%. Billions in market value evaporated. Her phone exploded with calls. She ignored all of them, walked into her building with her sons, their bloody clothes and butterfly bandages and 1,000-yard stares drawing gasps from employees who'd never seen their CEO look anything other than perfectly composed. Conference room. Now. Her assistant, a sharp woman named Patricia who'd been with her since the company's founding, didn't ask questions, just started making calls. 10 minutes later, Amara sat at the head of a long table with her legal team assembled. 5 attorneys, each a specialist in their field: civil rights, corporate law, media relations. They'd reviewed the video during the 10 minutes it took to gather. Now they looked at Amara with the kind of carefully neutral expressions lawyers adopted when they knew the case was going to define careers. We're filing. Her voice left no room for discussion. Federal civil rights violation, assault on a minor, corporate negligence, systematic discrimination. I want every person who touched this situation named, and I want discovery on every complaint filed against this airline for the past decade. The civil rights attorney, a black woman named Simone Washington, who'd made her reputation destroying discriminatory institutions, leaned forward. You understand this will be a siege. They'll fight discovery. They'll try to settle. They'll attempt to bury this under NDAs and sealed records. Let them try. I'm not settling. I'm not signing confidentiality agreements, and I'm going to make sure every victim who came before us gets their day in court too. Simone smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the smile of someone who'd been waiting for a client with the resources and determination to actually fight, instead of taking the payout and disappearing. Then let's burn it down. The video hit 10 million views before sunset. Isaiah's clear voice asking if they'd been called monkeys. Deirdre Castellano's chilling confirmation. The silence of every witness packed into first class, choosing comfort over courage. Social media platforms couldn't suppress it fast enough. Every time one version came down for community guidelines violations, 3 more appeared with slightly different titles. Flight attendant calls children monkeys. Airline racism caught on camera. 9-year-old stands up to discrimination. The algorithm loved conflict. The algorithm loved moral clarity. The algorithm loved watching powerful people get exactly what they deserved. By morning, Deirdre Castellano's name was trending alongside terms like racist and fired and criminal charges. Someone had found her Facebook profile before she could lock it down. Photos of her children, both white and blonde and smiling in front of a Christmas tree. The internet's sense of irony was sharp enough to draw blood. She has kids of her own, one viral tweet observed, and still called someone else's children monkeys. Captain Brock Thornton's pilot license number was public record. Aviation forums filled with pilots arguing about whether he'd violated federal regulations by ordering removal without investigating the complaint. Some defended him. Most didn't. The videos were too clear, the evidence too damning. Within 48 hours, 3 major pilot unions issued statements condemning the incident without naming Thornton directly. Everyone knew who they meant. Officer Tyrell Knox found his life dissected across true crime podcasts and legal analysis channels. The EMT report describing Isaiah's injuries became a public document through FOIA. Requests filed by 24 news organizations simultaneously. Laceration to right temple, multiple contusions, mechanism of injury consistent with being forcibly pushed. The clinical language couldn't hide what had happened. An armed officer had assaulted a 9-year-old child and walked away like it was procedure. Preston Whitmore III discovered that silence had a price tag. His investment firm, Morrison Whitmore Capital, managed $2 billion in assets, past tense, because by week's end, Okafor Innovations had withdrawn every dollar. The announcement came through a press release that didn't mention Flight 447 directly. But everyone connected the dots anyway. When the Wall Street Journal called for comment, Preston's carefully crafted statement about respecting client confidentiality rang hollow against footage of him closing his laptop while children rained down racism. 6 other clients followed Okafor's lead within 72 hours. The hemorrhage was public and devastating. Morrison Whitmore's stock price entered free fall. Preston's partnership agreement contained performance clauses that his co-founder began invoking with the cold precision of someone cutting dead weight. The elderly couple from row 3 never gave their names to media, but that didn't protect them. Their grandson recognized them in the video and posted about it on Reddit. Grammy and Pops were there when those kids got called monkeys and they didn't do anything. The thread exploded. Within hours, someone had identified them as Harold and Margaret Bishop, retired professors from Athens, Georgia. Their daughter called, voice tight with fury. "How could you? You marched in the 60s. You taught me to stand up for what's right, and you sat there like cowards." Margaret tried to explain about being afraid, about not wanting to cause a scene, about Harold's heart condition and the stress. Her daughter hung up before the excuses finished forming. The Bishop family Christmas card list got significantly shorter that year. Dr. Vivian Park received a letter from the Medical Ethics Board. A concerned citizen had filed a complaint. "Physicians take an oath to do no harm," the letter noted. "While your inaction on Flight 447 doesn't constitute direct medical malpractice, the board requests your presence at a hearing to discuss whether remaining silent during a violent assault on a minor violates the ethical standards of our profession." Vivian sat in her home office staring at that letter for an hour. She'd spent the past 3 days replaying the moment in her mind. Isaiah's blood, Elijah's screams, the way she'd half stood and then frozen, paralyzed by some calculus of social consequence versus moral obligation. She'd chosen wrong. The board's letter just made it official. But the harshest consequences landed on those who'd actively participated rather than passively enabled. Deirdre Castellano became unemployable overnight. Every application she submitted got rejected within hours. Background checks flagged her name immediately. Viral racist wasn't a protected class, and companies could fire at will. She tried retail, food service, cleaning companies, nothing. Her husband filed for divorce 6 weeks after the incident. The papers cited irreconcilable differences, but the real reason was simpler. He'd lost his job too, guilty by association, and he blamed her for destroying their family's future. Their children, 8 and 6 years old, would grow up Googling their mother's name and finding nothing but shame. Deirdre's lawyer tried to negotiate some kind of settlement with the airline, a severance package that might cushion the fall. The airline's response came through their legal team with brutal efficiency. Ms. Castellano violated company policy, federal anti-discrimination law, and basic human decency. She's owed nothing beyond her final paycheck. The final paycheck amounted to $417 after taxes. Captain Brock Thornton lost more than his job. The FAA launched an investigation into whether his actions constituted a violation of federal aviation regulations, specifically 14 CFR 91(3), which gave pilots command authority but didn't protect them from consequences when that authority was abused. The investigation discovered this wasn't Thornton's first complaint. 8 incidents over 15 years, all involving passengers of color, all dismissed after cursory review. Pattern evidence, Simone Washington called it when she deposed the FAA investigator. A systematic failure to hold accountable a pilot who repeatedly discriminated against passengers based on race. The investigator, a black woman named Teresa Okoye who'd spent 20 years navigating her own discrimination in aviation, didn't disagree. Her report recommended permanent license revocation. The FAA administrator, facing pressure from a viral incident and a paper trail of ignored complaints, approved it within a week. Thornton was 58 years old. He'd been flying since he was 19. Aviation was the only career he'd ever known, the only identity that mattered. Without his license, he was nobody. Applications to other aviation-adjacent jobs went nowhere. Corporate pilot positions required active licensing. Flight instruction required credibility he no longer possessed. Even crop dusting companies desperate enough to hire almost anyone with enough hours turned him down after Googling his name. His wife left after his pension got tied up in litigation. The airline argued that termination for cause voided certain retirement benefits. Thornton's lawyers disagreed. The case would take years to resolve and cost more in legal fees than any settlement would likely provide. She decided she didn't want to wait around to find out. Thornton ended up driving for a rideshare service, which lasted exactly 4 trips before passengers started recognizing him. The 1-star reviews piled up. "Isn't this the racist pilot?" one rider wrote. "Felt unsafe the whole trip." Another posted a photo of Thornton behind the wheel with the caption, "Found the guy who had those kids removed from his flight. Canceled immediately." The rideshare company deactivated his account for poor ratings. Officer Tyrell Knox faced the most serious legal consequences. Federal prosecutors charged him with assault on a minor under color of authority. The statute carried up to 5 years, and the U.S. attorney prosecuting the case had built her reputation on civil rights violations. She'd watched the video of Knox shoving Isaiah, watched the child's head connect with metal, watched blood sheet down a 9-year-old face while Knox reached for handcuffs instead of calling for help. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Knox's attorney argued that he'd been following procedure, that the situation had escalated quickly, that he'd perceived a threat when Isaiah grabbed his arm. The prosecution showed the video frame by frame, Isaiah weighing maybe 70 pounds, Knox outweighing him by 160. The physics didn't support threat. The physics supported excessive force against a child trying to protect his mother. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, guilty on all counts. Knox sat in the courtroom and showed no reaction when the verdict was read. His wife, seated behind him, started crying. Their 3 children, all under 12, didn't understand why Daddy had to go away, but they understood that something irreversible had happened. Sentencing came 2 months later. The judge, a stern woman who'd been a public defender before her appointment to the bench, delivered a statement before announcing the sentence. "Officer Knox, you were given a badge and the public's trust. You were empowered to protect the innocent and uphold the law. Instead, you used that power to brutalize a child whose only crime was trying to defend his mother from injustice. Your actions didn't just harm the Okafor family. They damaged every legitimate law enforcement officer who shows up every day trying to do right by their community." 3 years in federal prison. Badge revoked permanently. Knox's wife stopped crying, just sat there staring at nothing, calculating how they'd survive on no income with 3 kids and a husband in prison. The mortgage wouldn't pay itself. The car loans wouldn't forgive themselves. The life they'd built on a security officer's salary collapsed in the time it took a judge to speak 2 sentences. Daniel Robbins, the station manager who'd called Isaiah's bleeding head a minor injury, lost his job through a different mechanism. The airline fired him, but that was almost incidental. What destroyed Robbins was his own mouth. A local news station caught him outside the terminal 2 days after the incident, before the full scope of consequences had materialized. "Look, it's unfortunate what happened, but these situations are always more complicated than they appear," Security has to make split-second decisions. Sometimes people get hurt. That's just reality. The reporter pressed him. Even children? Robbins had shrugged. If they're interfering with security doing their job, yes. The clip played on every news channel for a week. Sometimes people get hurt became a meme, used ironically to describe any situation where powerful institutions harmed vulnerable people and tried to pass it off as inevitable. Robbins' LinkedIn profile disappeared. His Twitter account went private, then deleted entirely. Job applications to other airports, other airlines, other transportation companies all met with polite rejections that didn't mention Flight 447 but didn't need to. He ended up doing consulting work for a firm that specialized in crisis management, which seemed ironic given his inability to manage the crisis of his own unemployment. The pay was a third of his station manager's salary. His wife went back to work. They sold the house and moved into an apartment. Their daughter came home from school crying because kids had Googled her last name and found the videos. But the most complex consequences fell on someone who hadn't been present during the incident at all. Edward Castellano, chairman of the airline's board, faced a shareholder lawsuit within a month of Amara selling her stake. The suit alleged that he'd failed to disclose a material conflict of interest. His sister Deirdre's employment and pattern of complaints that had enabled systematic discrimination. Securities fraud carried civil penalties that could strip him of his position and personal assets. The SEC opened an investigation. Edward's lawyers worked 18-hour days trying to establish that he hadn't known about the complaint pattern, that the relationship had been coincidental rather than causal, that corporate governance systems had failed independently of his influence. The evidence suggested otherwise. Internal emails showed Edward had intervened twice when Deirdre faced disciplinary action for customer complaints. Both times he'd claimed he was simply ensuring fair process. Both times the complaints had been dismissed shortly after his involvement. The board voted to remove him pending investigation. Edward's stake in the airline was substantial enough that removal meant financial catastrophe. His wealth was tied up in company stock that had lost a third of its value. His reputation, built over 40 years in the industry, lay in ruins. He tried calling Amara once. The call went to voicemail. He tried email. Her assistant responded with a template message directing all communication through legal counsel. He tried sending a handwritten letter, something old-fashioned and personal that might bypass the corporate machinery. Amara read it once and handed it to Simone Washington, who filed it as evidence in the expanding lawsuit. The letter had contained an apology and an explanation about family loyalty and not understanding the full scope of the problem. Simone noted that it also contained an implicit admission that family connections had influenced corporate decisions. Useful in court. The systematic investigation Amara had demanded revealed horrors that went beyond 47 complaints. The airline's internal files extracted through discovery showed a pattern going back 12 years. Complaints were categorized by passenger demographics. Those from white passengers received immediate attention and compensation. Those from passengers of color faced intense scrutiny, were dismissed as misunderstandings, or were settled with minimal payouts attached to strict NDAs. Francesca Bellamy, the regional manager who'd overseen this system, had created an entire framework for minimizing what she called PR risk. The framework was elegant in its cruelty. Classify complaints by severity. Low severity got form letter apologies. Medium severity got flight vouchers and confidentiality agreements. High severity got settlements large enough to make litigation seem not worth the emotional cost, always contingent on the complainant signing away their right to speak publicly. The system had worked perfectly until someone with Amara's resources and determination decided that signing away the truth wasn't acceptable. Francesca found herself named in multiple lawsuits as additional victims came forward. The NDAs, Simone argued in filing after filing, were unconscionable when obtained under duress and used to hide systematic civil rights violations. Judges agreed. One by one, the confidentiality agreements got thrown out. One by one, victims who'd been paid into silence found their voices again. Dr. James Park testified at a preliminary hearing about the coffee incident. Maria Santos wrote an editorial for the Washington Post about having her designer bag searched, while white passengers sailed past security. Reverend Thompson appeared on CNN to describe missing his daughter's wedding because a captain had decided he didn't look like a pilot. Each story added weight to the pattern. Each testimony made it harder for the airline to claim these were isolated incidents rather than systematic failures. The cumulative effect was devastating. Francesca's legal bills exceeded her net worth within 6 months. Her house went into foreclosure. Her marriage collapsed under the stress and the social isolation of being married to someone the entire country had watched enable racism for a paycheck. She ended up in a studio apartment in a city where nobody knew her name, working remotely for a company that didn't Google potential hires carefully enough. The airline itself faced existential threat. Stock price collapse was just the beginning. The Department of Transportation launched an investigation into whether systematic discrimination violated the airline's operating certificate. Losing that certificate meant ceasing operations entirely. The new CEO, brought in to clean house after Edwards' removal, was a black woman named Angela Morrison who'd spent 20 years fighting discrimination in corporate America. Her first action was firing everyone in the chain of command that had touched the complaint process. 18 people lost their jobs in a single day, from regional managers to HR directors to the legal team that had drafted those NDAs. Her second action was implementing what she called the Okafor Accord, named explicitly after the family whose mistreatment had exposed the rot. Zero tolerance for discrimination. Immediate investigation of all complaints with third-party oversight. Mandatory reporting to the board for any incident involving race, disability, religion, or gender. Compensation for victims that didn't require confidentiality. The third action was opening the company's books to every victim from the past decade. Angela personally called 47 people whose complaints had been dismissed and offered renewed investigations, retroactive compensation, and public apologies. Not all of them accepted. Some wounds were too deep for corporate contrition to heal. But enough did that. The gesture meant something. The FAA took notice. Within 6 months, they'd drafted new federal guidelines based on the Okafor Accord. Airlines receiving federal operating certificates had to implement similar oversight mechanisms. The regulations carried teeth. Failure to comply meant license suspension. Congress got involved because Congress always got involved when something went viral enough. The House Transportation Committee held hearings. Isaiah and Elijah didn't testify. Amara refused to put her sons through that additional trauma, but Simone Washington appeared on their behalf with video evidence and documentation that made grown legislators flinch. Representative Sarah Chen, a California Democrat who'd built her career on civil rights legislation, introduced the Aviation Equality Act 3 weeks after the hearings. The bill mandated federal investigation of discrimination complaints in interstate travel, established criminal penalties for employees who abused passengers based on protected characteristics, and created a victim compensation fund separate from corporate settlements. The bill passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. Nobody wanted to be on record defending the right to call children monkeys on airplanes. President Carter signed it in a Rose Garden ceremony 6 months after Flight 447. Amara attended with Isaiah and Elijah, who wore suits that made them look even younger than 9 years old. The president, a white man in his 60s who'd spent his political career navigating the complicated terrain of race in America, knelt down to their level before the signing. What you did was incredibly brave. His voice was gentle. You stood up when adults around you chose silence. You demanded justice when the system tried to bury you. And because of your courage, this will be harder to happen to the next child. Isaiah's response was simple and devastating. It shouldn't take viral videos for people to treat kids like human beings. The president had no answer for that. He stood, signed the bill, and handed one of the commemorative pens to each boy. The photos would run on front pages across the country. 2 9-year-old black boys holding pens that had just transformed federal law, their faces serious beyond their years. The cultural shift took longer but cut deeper. Flight 447 became shorthand for complicit silence. Political commentators invoked it when discussing bystander responsibility. Corporate training programs used the video as a case study in what not to do. Parents showed it to their children and asked what they would have done in that cabin. The hashtag I would have spoken up trended for weeks as people convinced themselves they'd have been different from Preston Whitmore and the Bishops and Dr. Park. Activists noted the irony. Everyone thinks they'd have been brave until the moment arrives, and suddenly looking away seems so much safer than speaking up. But some people internalized the lesson genuinely. Reports of passengers intervening in discriminatory incidents increased measurably in the 18 months following Flight 447. Not everyone, not enough, but more than before. The video had planted a seed of shame that grew into something like accountability. 2 years after the incident, Amara received a letter. The return address was a women's correctional facility in New Mexico. She almost threw it away without opening it, assuming it was fan mail or hate mail or one of the other categories of correspondence that came with being publicly wronged. But something made her open it. The letter was from Deirdre Castellano. Not apologizing exactly, though there were elements of contrition buried in the defensive prose. Mostly it was an attempt at explanation. How she'd been raised, what she'd been taught about people who looked like the Okafors, how the airline culture had reinforced those beliefs rather than challenging them, how she'd convinced herself that what she'd said wasn't really racist because she'd said it quietly, because she hadn't meant it seriously, because everyone knew kids could be difficult on flights. The letter ended with a question. Do you think people can change? Or are we just what we were raised to be? Amara read it twice, showed it to Isaiah and Elijah, who were 11 now and sharper-edged than they'd been at 9. Their experiences had shaped them in ways both obvious and subtle. Isaiah had become quieter, more observant, quicker to recognize the microaggressions that preceded open hostility. Elijah had become fiercer, less willing to give adults the benefit of doubt, more likely to call out injustice immediately rather than waiting to see if it resolved itself. What do you think I should tell her? Isaiah considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I think people can change, but changing requires actually understanding what you did wrong, not just regretting that you got caught. Elijah was less charitable. She wants you to forgive her so she can feel better about herself. That's not the same as actually being sorry. Amara drafted a response that night, short and direct in a way Deirdre probably hadn't expected. People can change, but change requires more than regret. It requires understanding the harm you caused and working to prevent that harm from happening to others. If you're actually different now, prove it through action, not letters. Advocate for the people you once demeaned. Use your experience to educate others about how easy it is to dehumanize someone when you've been taught their humanity doesn't matter. Don't ask your victims for absolution. Earn redemption through the rest of your life. She never received a response. Whether Deirdre read the letter and took it to heart or threw it away in anger, Amara would never know. It wasn't her job to manage Deirdre's redemption arc. She had her own life to live and her own sons to raise in a world that still found too many ways to tell them they didn't belong. The final piece of closure came not through the legal system or through legislation, but through something quieter and more personal. 3 years after Flight 447, Amara and her sons boarded a plane from Atlanta to Los Angeles. Same route, different airline because she'd never used the original carrier again, but the same fundamental experience of getting on a plane and trusting strangers with your safety. The gate agent smiled warmly and processed their first-class tickets without comment. The TSA officer waved them through after a routine bag check. The flight attendants greeted them by name and offered drinks with genuine courtesy. Nothing happened. That was the remarkable part. They flew across the country without incident, without suspicion, without anyone questioning whether they belonged in the seats they'd paid for. Isaiah spent the flight reading a book about the civil rights movement. Elijah worked on calculus problems that would have challenged high school students. Amara responded to emails and thought about the meeting waiting for her in Los Angeles. Halfway through the flight, she noticed a family in economy. Latino mother and son, maybe 8 years old, the boy pressed against the window, watching clouds scroll past. The mother looked exhausted in that particular way that came from working 3 jobs and still barely keeping bills paid. Amara pressed the call button. When the flight attendant arrived, she made a request that surprised no one who knew her story. "I'd like to upgrade that family to first class, seats permitting." "On me." The attendant checked availability. 2 seats in row 4 currently empty. The upgrade processed smoothly. The family was summoned forward, confusion giving way to gratitude as they settled into leather seats that probably cost more than their entire trip. The boy's eyes went wide. The mother tried to refuse, certain there'd been a mistake. The attendant, who'd been briefed on exactly who Dr. Okafor was and what Flight 447 had meant, delivered a message Amara had requested. "Dr. Okafor wanted you to know that everyone deserves dignity when they travel. Enjoy the flight." Isaiah and Elijah had watched this exchange with knowing expressions. After the family settled in and the mother stopped trying to find the catch in this unexpected kindness, Isaiah signed a question to his mother. "Does it help, giving other people what we couldn't have?" Amara considered the question. Through the window, clouds stretched to the horizon, white against blue, peaceful and indifferent to the human dramas playing out in the metal tube cutting through them. "I don't know if it helps us, but maybe it helps them. And maybe that's enough." The plane flew on through clear skies. Below, America sprawled in patches of green and brown and gray, a country still wrestling with what it claimed to believe versus how it actually behaved. Flight 447 had changed some of that. Laws and policies and corporate practices that made discrimination marginally harder to commit and slightly more expensive to ignore. But the real change happened in quieter moments, in passengers who spoke up when they saw injustice instead of looking away. In children who'd learned from Isaiah and Elijah's example that courage didn't require being big or powerful, just required being willing to say that's not okay when everyone else stayed sunt. In families like the one now sitting in first class who'd been shown that kindness could appear in unexpected places if someone chose to offer it. The seatbelt sign chimed off. The flight attendant began beverage service. She reached row 2 and smiled at the Okafors with professional warmth that contained no hint of suspicion or judgment. "What can I get for you today?" "3 orange juices, please." Amara's voice was steady, unremarkable, the voice of any parent ordering drinks for her family. The attendant poured and served and moved on to the next row. Isaiah sipped his juice and returned to his book. Elijah worked another calculus problem. Amara closed her laptop and let herself breathe. This was what justice looked like in practice. Not perfect, not complete, not sufficient to undo the harm or erase the trauma. But better than it had been. Better than it might have stayed if two 9-year-old boys hadn't found the courage to speak truth when every adult around them chose the safety of silence. The plane descended into Los Angeles through golden afternoon light. Wheels touched tarmac. The captain's voice thanked them for flying and wished them well. The Okafor family gathered their belongings and prepared to deplane like any other passengers completing any other flight. But Isaiah paused at the exit, looking back at the cabin they were leaving. His hand found his mother's, small fingers squeezing tight. "We changed things, didn't we?" Amara looked at her son, at the scar still visible above his temple where Officer Knox had shoved him into metal hard enough to draw blood, at eyes that had seen too much but still held hope that the world could be better than its worst moments. "We started to, and other people will keep going. That's how change works, one voice at a time until silence is no longer acceptable." They walked off the plane together into California sunshine, into a future they'd helped build through courage, when courage had cost them everything and given them nothing but the knowledge that they'd refused to accept the unacceptable. Behind them, the Latino family exited first class, still marveling at their unexpected upgrade. Ahead, a country continued its long, incomplete journey toward treating everyone with the dignity that should never have required legislation to mandate. And somewhere, the video of Flight 447 still circulated, still taught its lessons, still asked its central question to everyone who watched. What would you have done?